Let me really quickly introduce myself to you again. My name is Melissa Schumi Jones. I'm one of the Cultural Affairs Officers here at the U.S. Embassy in Lima, Peru. And this is the first of a series of webinars that we're going to do for all of you English teachers that are listening today. Thank you again for joining us. And the subject is going to be different topics about American culture. And what we want to try to do is offer you some information that you can use in your classroom about these topics that we think are interesting facets of American culture. And as you can see, we're joined by English language fellow Ryan Brux, coming to us from Tarapoto, Peru. There's Ryan there. Hi, Ryan. And we're going to turn it over to him a little bit later on to talk about some of the activities and different things you can do in your classroom. So I'm going to get started here. And of course, there's going to be time for questions. And so please do continue to send your questions in when they come up, but also we'll ask some questions during the webinar so that you can share your thoughts with us or inquire about any topics that are of interest to you. So like I said, this webinar is going to be the first of a series on U.S. culture, and what we want to help you do is create a plan to use this information in your classroom. Again, please do ask your questions because that's the whole point of this webinar, is to share this information with you and help you use it. So I'm going to start with my first question. First question is, do you know who the man in this photograph is? Some of you might already know who he is, so if you do, can you tell me, what do you think he is thinking about? Well, since many of you probably know the answer to the question, I'm going to keep going. The gentleman in the photo is Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King and the ideals that he stood for are what we're going to talk about today in this webinar. And one of the reasons that we are having this conversation this month in February of, oops, what's going on there? Was it because we were hovering? Sorry about that. Going back to the slide that has Martin Luther King Jr.'s photograph on it. So one of the reasons why we're talking about Martin Luther King Jr. this year in 2013 is because it's the 50th anniversary of a really important speech that he made in 1963 in Washington, that's commonly referred to as the I Have a Dream speech. So we're going to be talking about that important speech in a little bit later today. So my second question is, what is Black History Month? This is a term that some of you might have heard, but it might be new to some others. So I'll answer my own question for you today. The month of February is the month that we in the United States designate as Black History Month. And the point of Black History Month is to bring attention to and honor the achievements of African Americans and to celebrate their influence on American society. This is something that emerged from the community of African American activists and historians in the early part of the 20th century, but it became formally recognized by the U.S. government in 1976, which was during our bicentennial or 200th year anniversary. When the president at that time, Gerald Ford, decided to identify February as Black History Month, this is what he said. He was urging Americans to seize the opportunity to honor the too often neglected accomplishments of Black Americans in every area of endeavor throughout our history. So after you've heard that, I want to see, does anyone have any questions about Black History Month in general as a concept, or what we mean by this idea of having a month designated to reflect on and honor the contributions of a specific group? Let me give you a minute to think about that. Now, some people, this is just to share with you a little bit more, this has been going on, as I said, for about 20, I guess we're at, what is that, 35, almost 40 years. Well, the Black History Month, this is a good question. Carlos is asking, since when exactly? Well, since 1976, this has been a formal recognition by the U.S. government, recognized in a lot of different ways throughout the government. Like we always have special stamps issued in schools. They pay special attention to these topics about the contributions of prominent African Americans in all sorts of fields. Could be science, could be literature, all different type of things. So this has been since 1976, but even earlier, way back in 1925, the activist that first came up with this idea was a historian named Carter Woodson, and he wanted to have a Black History Week at that time, but it later on became a Black History Month. You know, different groups, Yesenia from Lima is asking if there's any kind of celebration. Well, there's a lot of different things. It really depends on the community. There's no specific celebration that we always have every year for Black History Month, but we use it as an opportunity to highlight, like I said, specific leaders. There is, in the month of January, a holiday that I'll talk about a little bit later. But no specific celebrations other than events that individuals in their community might come up with, like maybe in a school or in a church or that kind of thing, but not a specific national celebration. So now I want to talk about the life of Dr. King. Dr. King is a civil rights leader. He was born in Atlanta, Georgia in 1929. He was a very, very good student from an early age. He actually went to college or started his college studies at age 15. He went on to study at a number of different universities. By the time he was just 25 years old, he became a pastor of a church called the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. And he went on, even after that point, to get his doctorate or his PhD in theology, and then he became known as Dr. King. What is important about Dr. King's mentality was that he espoused the concept of nonviolence as a means to achieve social change. So Dr. King was, when he was in Montgomery in about 1955, he and his colleagues, some of the other ministers and different community activists in that neighborhood, became the leaders of an event called the Montgomery Bus Boycott. Now that's sort of an interesting word, boycott. It might be new to some of you. A boycott means when you choose not to use the services of a certain store or a certain country, or in this case, the community, the African American community in Montgomery, Alabama, decided to stop using the bus system. And this actually happened as a result. It was kicked off by or got started by the action of Rosa Parks. Some of you may know the name of Rosa Parks. She was also an activist in the community of Montgomery, Alabama, and based on her actions in 1955, when she one day decided, well, not just one day, but one day it finally came to a head. She decided that she was going to take action, take a stand, and not give her seat up on the bus when she was asked to do so. Because in that time, the buses in Montgomery, Alabama were segregated. So segregated is another important word to know about. And that means when two groups are separated based on certain characteristics. In this case, the groups were separated based on the characteristics of race. So there were seats in the front of buses reserved for white bus riders, and there were seats in the back that were designated for black bus riders. So during that time, Martin Luther King also started an organization called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and that became a very influential leadership group for the civil rights movement. We call it the SCLC. The SCLC promoted this theory of, or this practice of nonviolent measures to protest the situations of segregation and discrimination in the United States. So the reason I chose these two pictures on the screen here are to show you examples of ways that Dr. King was involved in nonviolence or nonviolence resistance to segregation and discrimination. The picture in the bottom of your screen is a picture of Dr. King. He is accompanied by his wife, Coretta Scott King, and some other very important leaders of the civil rights movement, and they are engaged in a march, which was a very common practice in the civil rights movement. The other photograph, I don't think it was taken at the exact time when he did this, but the other photograph is to represent when Dr. King was imprisoned in Birmingham, Alabama, which happened in 1963. And during that imprisonment, he wrote a very famous document called The Letter from a Birmingham Jail, where he addressed many of his critics who argued with the methods that he used and the motivation for his strike. So I really like that photo because it shows him confronting the reality, which was his imprisonment. At times, he was imprisoned multiple times, or arrested and put into prison multiple times, as was Rosa Parks when she took the action that she took in Montgomery that instigated the Montgomery bus boycott. I love this picture here. This picture comes from 1963, and it is a scene overlooking the Washington Mall, the National Mall, I'm sorry, and the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. And this shows you a picture of the people gathered for the March on Washington, which was about 250,000 people that gathered for this march, which was, the formal name was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And this is the event in which Martin Luther King delivered his famous speech that we now refer to as the I Have a Dream speech. So for many people, there is a famous scholar who said that this speech was one of the first times that the rest of America, including white America, really saw Martin Luther King and saw a very eloquent leader of the civil rights movement express his vision for the United States. So this picture right here on the slide is a picture of Dr. King delivering his speech. And this speech has gone down in history as one of the best oratory declarations of any American in history. And what was so important is that Dr. King, with his eloquence as a preacher, as a minister, someone who commanded the attention of everyone who listened to him, he presented his vision of what the United States could be when it was free of this burden of segregation and discrimination. And these words that he said, his vision for the country included the United States being a place where people were not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Now, these are famous words from his speech that even when I was growing up, you know, this was always something that I knew and associated with Martin Luther King. These are words that really have always stuck in my mind as an ideal, not just for the United States, but for all countries that want to have a more peaceful, respectful interaction between their citizens. So I actually want to read to you an excerpt from the speech of Dr. King. I hope that some of you, when you look at this, when you look into other resources about Martin Luther King or Black History Month, that you take the time to listen to a clip on YouTube or read the words of the speech, because it's really beautiful. And I cannot do the same, I can't do it as justice as Dr. King, but I do want you to hear some of these words. And so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even in the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that one day, my 4 little children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and little white girls as brothers and sisters. I have a dream today. Now, even though I've read that speech many times and I've heard those words spoken, for me as an American, they really resonate very strongly. I'd like to stop for a minute here and see if anyone has some thoughts they want to share or some questions before we continue talking about the life of Dr. King. Now, while you do that, I would also like to, yes, Dr. King actually, Ray is mentioning that the beliefs of Gandhi are very similar to the beliefs of Dr. King, and it's true. They both espouse the means of nonviolence as opposed to violent means to achieve their goals. So this was very, very important to all of the different fights that Dr. King was engaged in. The other thing I wanted to mention, I think we have another question here. Sure. Oops. Sorry, that went away. We have a question from Orlando in Lima. Well, I'm going to keep going and talking about some of the things that did change after that speech. One thing to remember is that, you know, just like in any culture or country, things take a while to change. But what happened with that speech and what made it so such a turning point or such a focal moment in the civil rights movement is the fact that was for the first time it was the first time it was televised, that many people across the country were able to see and hear the words of the civil rights movement spoken by someone who so passionately was fighting for that cause. So for many, especially white Americans, they hadn't heard from a leader of the civil rights community. So it was a really, really important moment. So one thing that did happen in the year following that that speech was the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. The picture that you're seeing is a picture of Dr. King at the side of President Johnson right after he signed that bill or that piece of legislation into law. The importance of the Civil Rights Act is that it outlawed or banned major forms of discrimination on the basis of race, of ethnic background, of religious beliefs, and also addressed discrimination against women. So legally, there was a major change in the United States during that time where the government and the president and the legislature took a stand and said that discrimination based on race and those other characteristics was against the law and was wrong. So in that year, later on in that year, Dr. King actually was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to combat racial discrimination using nonviolence. During this time, the movement of the civil rights community continued. It was still continuing across the South, where segregation, even though it was outlawed, was had to take root in each community, and local laws had to be changed, and all of these things that take time were going on. It was also happening in the movement was also reaching into the northern states, and was focused a lot on economic issues, economic marginalization, discrimination in housing. Even though it was outlawed, there were still people that carried on beliefs that effectively created discrimination in their communities or in different practices. So it was a process that was ongoing. So this is a picture of that protest again, just to give you an idea that the movement was still continuing very actively in different parts of the country. But another thing that Dr. King became very involved in was he opposed the war in Vietnam that the United States was engaged in at that time. And he became very vocal. There in this picture in the bottom there, he's speaking in a rally against the Vietnam War. One of his main concerns, as he was very concerned about poverty and economic issues overall, one of his main concerns was that the money that was being spent to fund the war could have been better used to deal with economic issues or domestic issues in the United States. So it's really important to remember that Dr. King's vision wasn't just about civil rights or ending segregation or making it so that people could sit anywhere they wanted to on public transportation. It was about really transforming society into a more equitable place for everyone, including economically more equitable for people. And sadly, Martin Luther King, at the young age of 39, was assassinated for his work, for believing what he did and the actions that he took. He had traveled to Memphis, Tennessee, with a group of his colleagues to support some workers, some black workers that were fighting their local union. And he was outside his hotel room prior to going to events in the evening, and he was shot and died about an hour later in Memphis, Tennessee. Now, throughout his life, Dr. King had received death threats. His home had been bombed. So he was aware of those things, and Celia has made a comment here about how much courage that it took for his beliefs and for the actions that he took. And I think that's very true, that he went ahead. I mean, he knew even when he traveled to Memphis, Tennessee, that there were people that were opposing his trip and his actions. His flight there on the plane had been threatened with a bomb. This was something that he lived with every day and still continued the fight. So the other question about things that's changed, I think that it's important to know how deeply the life of Dr. King influences American society today. He's very much a reference point, the idea of an American hero and a leader that we still discuss, and he's still a subject of a lot of discussion, both scholarly and in schools. In January every year we celebrate his birthday with a federal holiday, which means government workers don't have to go to work, students don't have to go to school. This became a federal holiday in 1986, and a lot of people, including our President Obama and his wife Michelle, are very active in the concept that Martin Luther King Day is a day of service, a day that people should return to their communities and take action, whether they're volunteering, whether they're helping a neighbor, but take active action to help help their community improve. Sylvia from Lima is asking whether Dr. King received help from other countries. I think that that's a very interesting question. You know, in that time, I don't really know much about whether other countries were involved in the civil rights movement. I know he traveled to India. I know he was recognized by the Nobel the Nobel Committee for his work when he won the Nobel Prize. But I think that mostly he was focused on these domestic issues. I don't know. That's a really good question. Something maybe when we talk a little bit more about the resources that are available, that may be something that that would be fun to look into and research a little bit more. So, does anyone have any questions? Well, I take a sip of tea. Does anyone have more questions about Dr. King, about the subjects that we've been talking about here today? Then we'll go into our discussion about the lesson plan and all those fun topics there. Let me get a sip of tea while you guys think about your questions. While you're thinking, I also wanted to mention something I forgot to mention at the beginning. When we talk about American culture, or when I say that word, I know that some people are bothered by that term, and I understand that. What I'm referring to is the culture of the United States, but it's just a little bit easier to say American culture than to say United Statesian culture. So I hope you'll understand that and not take offense, but I recognize that that's something that some people feel uncomfortable with. So I hope you understand that. Okay, from Angela and EE.UU, we're talking about how inspiring that speech was. And yes, I think part of the reason why I wanted to talk about this today, and this is a very, from my perspective, is a very academic webinar that we're doing today and talking a lot about history, but part of the reason I wanted to talk about it and why it's important to us as an embassy or as a cultural section to share it with you is because this is something that in many ways our country is still working to live up to those ideals. And I think many countries also face that, the struggle for equality amongst its citizens. And so this is a topic, and when we talk about engaging with our students, I think it's really a great way to get students to think about their own country, to think about issues of equality in their communities or in their country in many different ways. So this is still a topic incredibly relevant, even though we're talking about historical details. I know there's some great questions coming in, or maybe it's early in the morning and everyone hasn't had their café con leche yet, but we're excited to be here doing this webinar with you. Oh, Pedro was asking, was Dr. King married and had children? Yes. If you can see actually in this picture here in the PowerPoint that we have up is Dr. King's wife, Coretta Scott King, who was they were married, I think, before he went to Montgomery to be the pastor at the Dexter Avenue Church. Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King were the parents of 4 children. Martin Luther King Jr. III, Yolanda King, Bernice King, I believe, and let me see, I have the name of his 3rd son, which, I'm sorry, his 4th son, yes. Yolanda Martin Luther King III, oh, Dexter Scott King and Bernice Albertine King. Yes, so he did have 4 children. And what's really important to know is, you know, Mrs. King was a very strong woman and an activist. She passed away in 2006, I believe. But she was very, very active in promoting Dr. King's legacy, as are all his children. Oh, yes, and that's the question coming from Carlos. Yes, they did. There's a King family library and legacy, and certainly they are very, very involved in continuing this the legacy of their father and taking it in new directions as well. So I believe it was just 2 years ago that the King Memorial in Washington was inaugurated. And that's really important because remember that picture of the speech and the march on Washington that showed all those thousands of people there, and Dr. King's speech came from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, which was a monument to our president, who was integral in passing the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, where slavery was formally abolished. Now Dr. King himself, this activist, this person who fought for equality of citizens in our country, also has a monument on the National Mall where all these monuments to important presidents sit. Well, in order to continue with that, I know there's lots of great questions, and hopefully we will get more time at the end to answer it. But I want to move on to our next phase, and I'm going to start this portion. But then we'll turn it over to Ryan, who you all know, who is the awesome expert on these things. But I'm going to give it a shot just to kick things off. And we're going to talk about planning a lesson around these topics. So the first thing, I know that many of you have heard this before, but in order to have a good lesson, the important thing first is to plan ahead for your lesson. Be prepared before your students come into classroom. So we've just put those top 4 questions that you need to ask yourself as you plan your lesson. Number 1, of course, what are you going to talk about? What are your topics? So in this instance, hopefully your topic would be Black History Month, the Civil Rights Movement, the life of Dr. Martin Luther King, perhaps also his I Have a Dream speech. The second question is the fun one. What kind of questions or conversation starters do you want to use to help your students start thinking about it? Not just answering yes or no questions like, have you heard of Martin Luther King? Like I did at the beginning. That wasn't a very good conversation starter. But then I asked, what do you think he's thinking about? Which is a more exciting question because that actually helps students think about a little bit more in depth about the topic and express their own ideas. Another question is, what kind of new vocabulary do you need? What new vocabulary do you need to teach the topic, to tell the story? What kind of vocabulary do your students need to embrace this topic and express their own feelings about it? I've used some of these really good words, and we're going to go over them too, and we've made a list for you. That's just the beginning. There's definitely a lot of room to add new words to that. And 4, of course, the very important thing is what activities can you do with your students that focuses their attention on this topic. Now, just to give you a little bit of time, I want to hear from you if you can type in your questions or conversation starters that you think would be good for this topic. I'm sure you've got great ideas as well. But in order to give you some time to do that, I'm going to skip ahead to the vocabulary slides. And what we've done with the vocabulary slides for the purposes of our webinar is separate them out into beginner vocabulary and then more advanced vocabulary. But of course, you'll know where your students are and what kind of vocabulary level they are at for this. So some of my favorite words from this topic are leader, the word dream. I love the word dream because you can use it for so many different things. We've got equal, we've got rights, history, and freedom. These are all great words. And later on, we'll show you where to get this PowerPoint because I've put the definitions in there. So you have definitions real quick. We won't go over those right now because a lot of you probably know the words and can go over them with your class or however you like. In this thought bubble or word bubble, because we want to get your students to speak these words and to use them and pronounce them, are some of the phrases that are important as well. So you've got complicated words like segregation, which we talked about before, equality, the concept of nonviolence that we talked about, and also this other term that is very important to the civil rights movement is separate but equal. It's in quotes because that was a legal term for describing how, in theory, segregation was acceptable because although the accommodations were separate, or the opportunities or the areas were separate, they were equal for people of different races. But in reality, that did not always, that usually was not the case. And so some people who believed in segregation used that as an excuse. So that was an important phrase. So we have all those. I think people are getting ideas already, which is exciting. Those are the definitions again. So do we have any discussion questions, ideas? Or questions in general? In case you're wondering, that's another picture of Dr. King during the time that he was speaking to the March on Washington. Sylvia is asking if there's a balloon vocabulary for intermediate students. Well, not this time, there wasn't. I think that in reality, the advanced vocabulary could be used for intermediate students as well. From here, it's difficult for us to know exactly what the level for each class. You know, people might have different ideas about what advanced or intermediate really means. So our idea is not to answer all the questions or provide everything, but help get you started on and give you lots of resources to hopefully bring this into your classroom. But I know it's going to require for some adaptation as you make it work for your students, but hopefully this will give you a start. I love this question from Hilda. You read my mind. I have some examples of meaningful questions that I hope you will like. And again, these are just the start. So some questions that I thought are, what are civil rights? Or how does a country protect a citizen's civil rights? I really want you to ask your students what they think about racial inequality. I want to hear or have you ask them and start them thinking about, does this exist in their community or their country? I think the most fun question is after you've talked about the I have a dream speech, you could ask them what they think the meaning of that phrase is. What does it mean, I have a dream? Why did Dr. King repeat that phrase so many times during his speech? What was the impact of saying that? And also to ask them what their dream is for their country. Here in Peru, we have, a lot of wonderful teachers like in many of the countries, all these countries that we're working with, and we are working on a project to share the dreams of some students from Peru, and we're going to put it together in a video. So hopefully that will be a fun way to commemorate this speech. Hernando has a great question. Is there a possibility of finding a common ground between ourselves as people? Think between, is there a way to find a common ground between people of different races, different religions, different belief systems? That's really something I think that could take you through a week of class. So that's a great question, Hernando. Anybody else have brilliant ideas? Ooh, oh, yes, there's some good ones. Ooh, there's a great one from Ray here. Starting from a more basic concept is, what rights do you think everyone should have? What rights should every person or human being have? These are great questions. So you can see it really, that there's a lot of variety, there's a lot of options for how you can take the discussion, and each of you knows your students best and can really determine that, what would interest them, what motivates them to talk or to use the new vocabulary and use these concepts that they have just been learning about. So here is probably the moment that you've all been waiting for, which we turn it over to Ryan in Tarapoto so he can talk about activities. So in the meantime, if you have more questions, please feel free to send them in. I'll have either questions for me or questions from Ryan, and we'll put those up and he'll answer it. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Ryan. Thanks very much.
Well, first of all, thanks to you, Melissa. This is really a lot of information, and it's a wealth of information. I know I've certainly learned a lot this morning, and I hope that our webinar viewers have as well. Good morning, everybody. We're from Tarapoto this morning. My part in the presentation is to give you teachers out there some ideas for putting all of this together. A lot of you may be asking, well, there's so much information about Martin Luther King Jr., but how can I present it to my students in a meaningful way? And I think I'd just like to stop right here and just, this is a really kind of a neat collaboration between the Office of Cultural Affairs and the RELO office. And I think you as educators are now beginning to see the relationship between culture and language. And so I think that this is kind of it's a neat thing that we're doing here. Melissa and I have really been working together to provide all of the information within this PowerPoint. Everything is really self-contained. As you can see, we did the vocabulary, and I think that's going to really help begin the conversation in your class, really to kind of activate students' prior background knowledge. And I think that this is further done through the discussions and the questions that you ask as a teacher. I think you can really generate a spirited conversation through these questions that you ask your class. Now, my favorite part, and for those of you who have been in any of my workshops, is to do something that really extends learning, and that's through doing an activity or a project that really helps students make those connections to their lives and to extend their learning. So the project I'm going to speak about today, this morning, is a project I've done I've done it with beginner students. I've done it with advanced students. I've done it with young learners, and I've done it also with adults, most recently with the Rising Stars group. I think Angela from EE.UU is on our webinar this morning, and I believe that she's seen this. I have to admit that I put this together and I wasn't really quite sure how it was going to go, but I've been shocked by the learning outcomes that have occurred, and even more so by like the emotional effect that this activity has had on teachers and students and even educators themselves. I have to admit here that in a part later on that I'm going to show you about, I've actually teared up because it was such an emotional experience. So moving forward, given a, let's say, a 90-minute class, I think you could dedicate the first 45 minutes of the class to developing the background information, going through vocabulary, and especially going through that conversation. I think it's a great way to open up a speaking opportunity for students. And then I would take the last half of the class, 45 minutes, and work on this activity. The activity is in actually two parts. Part one of the activity is a timeline activity, and it is working with the important events in Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. We have actually submitted this timeline on slideshow.com, so you can have access to that link at the end of this PowerPoint. So let me move on here. So in the first part of the activity, what I will do is go through a small presentation of the major events. You can kind of see here, I've put it on a PowerPoint. I like the PowerPoint for the sake of what we have now, a lot of larger classes. And so a PowerPoint, you can be creative, show visuals, post it up on a large screen, and you can turn it into a shared reading exercise. You can review vocabulary. I will often ask comprehension questions about each slide, basically just to get students to understand each part of the slide. So second, after I'm done with my little presentation, I'll split students up, and I will split them up into groups, maybe 8 to 10 students, depending upon the number of students I have. At each group, I have the slides that I've printed out, except this time, the slides do not have any text. So why would I do that? Well, I think it's also important to assist students in their writing and their free writing abilities. And so what we have here is students can break up into groups, and they can negotiate meeting and kind of sum up the events of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life by writing down a summary. Seems that we might be having a little bit of a difficulty switching over our slides. There we go. The last part is, and this is step 3, is I have students put the events in order. And I've done this with teenagers and I've done it with adults, and competition seems to be really a motivating force for these two groups. So what I'll do, I'll time the students and I'll say, all right guys, put the events in order. And so there's this incredible energy in the room as they're all negotiating meaning and trying to tell each other what event goes before what and what event goes after. And I think it really from an assessment point, it really helps me, the teacher who is monitoring all of this, to know that students are actually understanding the timeline concept and are able to put the events of MLK's life in order. As you can see here, what I did is I just hung some rope and bought some cheap plastic clothes hangers or some safety pins, clothing pins. This cost me less than 75 cents. And I think what's great about it is you can change out the activities, and it's a great way to show off your student work in a very inexpensive way. And what I will do then is, if there's time, I will have students in the group discuss or rehash the events, and this helps them practice their speaking skills. All right, and part 2 of the project is making the connection to the self. And I think that this is really important, because isn't that really what learning is all about anyways? Melissa, earlier, she had read part of MLK's I Have a Dream speech. And, you know, I would safely argue that that speech was one of the most important speeches of the 20th century. And I would strongly urge you to take the time to show at least a part of it to your students. As you can see on this, we have linked a short clip from MLK's I Have a Dream speech. It's a YouTube clip. It's about 2 minutes in length, just a small section of the speech. But I think it would give students an idea for how powerful and moving that speech actually was. So after we watch the I Have a Dream speech, we'll move into an activity I've just labeled it the Dove activity. And what I have is a Dove template that I've copied for enough students. And as you can see here on the left, students write down their dreams. And now these students here are from our Access program. Some of them have had about 2 weeks of English, some of the newer students, and they were actually able to do this activity. And I've also done it with adults, with the Rising Stars, as I mentioned, and you're going to get more sophisticated answers, of course. But I think that's the real joy in this activity, is it allows students of different abilities to perform and be a part of a greater project. And so what we will do, we'll discuss dreams. We will discuss, you know, what would you like to do personally, professionally? What is a goal that you have for the world? An example might be, my dream is to raise a family and have nice, well-behaved children. And so what I would do is you will articulate that dream on a piece of paper on the Dove template. And I usually give students about 10 minutes. I really want them to reflect and take it to a deeper level and to produce language. And I think it's surprising to a lot of students about, and I think it's surprising to teachers as well, what their students will produce. And then as you can see on the right here, I will go back to that timeline and hang up, and have students hang up the doves. And as you can see by that picture, if you have about 40 students in a class, you're going to have this really amazing visually stimulating piece of work, student created. And it's really just a moving thing. And what I will do at the end, and I think that this is really the kind of the icing on the cake, if you will, is I'll say, students, why don't you take 5-10 minutes, walk around, and take a look at your fellow classmates' dreams. And the energy in that room, it changes, and it becomes almost this museum. It's very quiet, and you're really setting the scene up for it. It's very moving because people are comparing their dreams. They're reading the dreams of their classmates, and it is really just this cool thing. And when I said that I teared up before, this was when I teared up, because you just really get to see the diversity in people's dreams. And then what I'll do following that is just do a small reflection activity. How did you feel about this? And that's about it. It takes really, in all, I would say you can move this two-part activity along in about 45 minutes to an hour, but I would urge you not to rush it. I think that this is a really sensitive topic, but I think very powerful as well. So take your time with it. If there's any other questions, I'd be happy to field those right now. Otherwise, I will move it back to Melissa for our conclusion. We have a question from Omar. How to avoid conflict in the classroom with a topic like this? I think it's a great question, Omar. And I think it's definitely bringing it back to yourself. And I think you can do this in the conversation questions, relating it back to your own country. It is a sensitive topic. Civil rights is a sensitive topic. Absolutely. And so I think it's, here I would premise it by saying the teacher has an enormous amount of responsibility to, to really listen and to kind of monitor the conversation. And I think also, the dove activity will allow, it to be less controversial and to make it more personal. So this is what I would offer for you right now.
Okay, thank you very much, Ryan. That was awesome. I'm just going to really quickly share some of the resources that we put together and remind you that there's a lot of different websites out there, including some of those that are from the embassy or the State Department. We have the American English webpage, the Relo Andes webpage. Oops, there we go again, going too fast. And remember that on the Relo Andes webpage, okay, sorry, that was someone here. We'll just stop back. That's a little bit of excitement for everybody. The Relo Andes webpage, their blog there, that's where you can find links to these presentations, as well as the timeline that Ryan was talking about. So that is on the Relo Andes webpage or blog, found in the right-hand side under presentations. I've also put a list, 2 websites. If you click on these links when you're in the presentation, you can get to Larry Ferlazzo's page, and he's got lists about websites to use for resources to talk about Black history or to talk about Martin Luther King. So those are great resources. The other thing that we did, and I want to just share it with you quickly, is that we created a lesson plan template just so that you can see how we were thinking about creating this webinar and creating this this presentation for you. And you can zoom in on that, I think, when you view and download the presentation. But it just breaks down what we're talking about, some of the vocabulary, the ideas for our questions and conversation starters, and then talks about the different activities. So this is just a basic guide for lesson planning too that might be useful if you don't have a guide that you already like to use. So before we conclude, are there any final questions? I think our colleagues here is going to put up the links to the slide share where you can download this, or again, you can always get it from reloandes.com. But if you have any final questions now, we have a couple minutes. There's the link, everybody. think we're running out of time, so there might be a quick survey. We hope you have enjoyed the webinar, that it will be useful to you and your students. We're looking forward to doing about once a month this series, and definitely looking for your feedback, whether you want to post it on Relo Andy's Facebook or any of the other media that ways that you have to talk to us. We're really excited, and we thank you for the time that you spend talking about these topics of American culture with your students and sharing